Hey everyone, and welcome back to another video. I hope you're okay with a slightly more kind of unplanned, unscripted video today. I just kind of wanted to do something a little more relaxed. A video where I don't have all the answers. I mostly just want to kind of help try and facilitate a conversation that I think is very, very important. As a lot of you may know, if you keep up with TV and film news and stuff like that, the wonderful Elliot Page just came out as transgender. You might know him from films like Juno and great TV series like Umbrella Academy. And there's a really, really interesting conversation to be had. I guess one of the things that got me thinking was I saw a great post on Instagram the other day, which we're going to be reading through in a second, that kind of brought up not necessarily a question or whatever, but just like kind of the point that although Elliot is a man, the character he is currently playing on an ongoing TV series is a cisgender woman. So I guess it kind of helps facilitate a conversation and brings up a lot of questions about kind of like who can play who on TV and film and what's appropriate, what isn't, and so on. And I don't just want to talk about Elliot here, but I want to talk about kind of lots of different examples. And I also want to not only talk about gender identity, but also sexuality and race and a few other issues like that. Maybe even age representation to some extent. So I think the way to do this, I haven't really planned it, is we're probably going to start by reading through this Instagram post, and then I'm just going to ramble my thoughts at you, and hopefully we can have an interesting and informative conversation about this kind of thing, and you guys can share your thoughts. And like I say, this isn't me coming to you in this video saying I have all the answers. This is more of me saying I have questions and thoughts and ideas, and this is where I'm at, but I'm willing to change my mind on some things. I'm willing to be educated, and hopefully I can help educate some other people as well in the process. I don't know, we'll see. Let's do this. So the post that I am referring to, that I want to kind of use as a jumping off point for this, was posted by the University of Manchester's Feminist Collective, and really interesting little post. I've nothing to do with the University of Manchester, but interesting little Instagram account that brings up lots of interesting points and bits of information. Anyway, the post was titled Acting Identity, Elliot Page and Umbrella Academy. And I'm just going to read through this post for you, and like I say, we'll talk about it after. So, context. On December 1st, Elliot Page came out as trans. His preferred pronouns are he, they. Best known for his role in Juno, Elliot Page has most recently played the part of Vanya, she, her, in Umbrella Academy, due to return for a third season. The prospect of a trans man playing the role of a cis woman has sparked debate. Casting diversity. There's been recent backlash against casting actors in roles that encompass identities different from their own. Sia recently made a short film, Music, in which non-autistic Maddie Ziegler, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, played an autistic character. The decision not to offer the role to someone with autism sparked controversy on two accounts. One, portrayal. Casting an autistic actor in this instance would have ensured a respectful, accurate representation of autism. It would ensure that autism was depicted genuinely, not through an ableist gaze. This principle can be applied to any character who identifies as a marginalised group and would ensure that on-screen representation didn't perpetuate harmful, ignorant tropes. 2. Opportunity. Given the lack of diversity in Hollywood, it would make sense to offer specific roles to those from minority groups. It is important to recognise that certain demographics have much better opportunities in Hollywood. Scarlett Johansson played the role of a Japanese robot in Ghost in the Shell, originally a Japanese manga comic. It could have been more beneficial to offer the role to a Japanese woman who otherwise faces greater challenges in the casting world of Hollywood. Problem being, pigeonholing. However, only offering minority character roles to minority actors risks reducing these actors to certain roles. For instance, a trans actor may continue to be typecast in only trans roles, defined by their trans identity alone, and not their talent as an actor. It's crucial that we don't reduce characters or actors to one facet of their identity. Other issue being outing. Discussing queer identity in casting is particularly complicated. Asserting the view that only trans people can play trans people relates to only out trans people can play trans people. This is dangerous and could actively harm actors. It is up to the individual what they want to share about themselves to the world. Power dynamics. There can be no blanket rule for casting minority characters. This would stifle creativity and undermine the complexity of tackling marginalisation. Instead, an ongoing conversation about the power dynamics on and off screen needs to be had. Honest and fair representation needs to be at the heart of Hollywood. And therefore, going back to the context of Elliot Page, the character of Vanya from Umbrella Academy is a cis woman. There is a surplus of cis women in Hollywood who could play this part. Elliot Page's continuation of this role does not harm the representation of women in Hollywood. It is up to him whether he wants to continue to act this part, because at the end of the day, acting is about embodying someone different to yourself. And I think that last line is very true. Therefore, to some extent, I don't think it always matters who the actor is that's playing a role. However, I do think there are cases where it's better to hire an actor who maybe physically fits the role of who you want. So, for example, if we're talking about race and you have a black character, it's not a good idea to hire a white actor and put them in blackface. That's never a good idea. That's never gonna work. That doesn't help anyone. That's just stupid. However, if you have a character where their race doesn't really matter, I don't think it necessarily matters who you hire as long as they can act well in the role, if that makes sense. So when we talk about like acting identities and stuff, there's lots of different kind of facets we can talk about with this. Gender identity being one, sexuality being another, kind of ableist and versus like differently abled and neurotypical versus non-neurotypical, that kind of thing. Neurodivergent, is that a word? Yeah. There's also things like ages and stuff. There's I don't know if I've mentioned race is another issue. And it all gets very, very complicated. And of course, it's easy to look at where we're at now and say, well, the best actor for the role should get the job. It doesn't necessarily matter who they are, what their background is, their physical characteristics, blah, blah, blah. But when we look back at the history of acting, remember in, say, Elizabethan England, for example, when Shakespeare was putting on a lot of his plays, women weren't allowed to act. It wasn't done. Women were stifled from being in those professions, so any female characters had to be played by men dressed as women. In this case, women were being purposely stifled and men were given their roles to help to help keep women in that position of powerlessness. And I think we need to be very, very careful and aware today that when we're casting roles, even though we might want to make sure we just have the best actor for the job, we have to be very careful that we're not stifling minorities in that same way. If for example, you give the role of a character who is traditionally black to an actor who isn't black, it might be unintentional. You might think, well, they're just the better actor, but you are, to some extent, perpetuating inequality and stifling black and minority actors, and that's not okay. So you have to be very aware of those kinds of things, where even if you're not intentionally replacing someone or you're not intentionally stifling minorities, you can be doing it. And I think that's something very important to consider in this whole conversation. So I guess looking at the case of Elliot Page and Umbrella Academy, it should all really come down to what kind of roles Elliot is comfortable playing. He established himself playing roles of a cisgender woman, so why now that he's come out should he ever be, like this post said, pigeonholed into, for example, only playing roles as trans men? Why can't he, if he wants to, if he enjoys the role, if he's going to be good in the role, continue to play a cis woman in this role that he's already established and been fantastic in? Why can't he go on to play transgender men if he wants in films? Why can't he go on to play cis men in films if he wants? I think it should all be about what his skills are as an actor, what he can bring to the table in that professional sense, but also what he's comfortable with. So another example would be, say, to look at Laverne Cox's character in Orange is the New Black. So she obviously plays, well, she is a transgender woman who plays a transgender woman in the show, but she had to have her character had flashback scenes before transition. And while she was willing to play those and essentially, like, I guess, dress up as a man for the role, the directors were worried that it would be uncomfortable for her and that it would be difficult. So they asked her brother to play that role while she played that character post-transition. So if we start making claims of, well, only transgender people can play trans characters and only cis people can play cis characters and so on, if we start making definitive claims like that, what do we do when we have a storyline like, I cannot remember the character's name, Sophia, there we go. So then what do we do when TV or film wants to portray a storyline so like Sophia's in Orange is the New Black, which shows both pre and post transition? You can't just hire transgender people who have siblings of an opposite gender who look a bit like them, because that's really going to narrow what actors you can get. That's a problem. So do you only hire transgender people and then potentially make them feel gender dysphoria again by asking them to present as their kind of the gender they don't identify as? And this, I think, is where it comes down to what the actor themselves is comfortable with. I don't see why you shouldn't just hire the right person for the job who's gonna be good at acting and good at portraying both roles if that's what they're comfortable with. Another kind of example to kind of counteract this would be when people got mad at Eddie Redmayne for playing a transgender woman in the film The Danish Girl. I'm not quite sure I'm like expressing my points correctly here, but and a lot of people think you should have actually used a trans woman in that role because it would have given an opportunity to more transgender actresses. Um, you would have had kind of better representation. Um, she would probably kind of portray the role more authentically or kind of like being able to bring more like actual real life experience to it. I get all that, but I'm gonna be honest, I've not seen the film, so I don't know if there are pre-transition roles here. But again, I'm gonna kind of bring this up. Say you have a transgender woman playing a transgender woman, and she has to play pre-transition scenes. That isn't always, but could be quite emotionally damaging for that actress. She might not want to see herself that way anymore. So, what do you do? I agree there should be more opportunities and more representation for transgender actors. Absolutely. However, another point is it comes back to kind of like pigeonholing as well. It's not really fair, is it, if transgender actors can only play transgender characters? What if, an amazing trans actress wants to go on and play a role of an iconic cis woman like Jane Eyre or why can't I think of any more female characters? You kind of want all actors to be able to take the roles that they think they're right for and that they'll be good at. It's tough because, if trans actors can play cis roles, you have to ask, well, why can't cis actors play trans roles? But then again, it comes back to like, on the one hand, that would be great because at least we're getting more trans characters to the mainstream and it's becoming more normalized, and that's a wonderful thing, and their stories are being told. But on the other, you're like, well, is this unintentionally stifling trans actors and kind of replacing them in the same way women were replaced by men in Shakespearean plays? It's a very fine line, and you don't always know where to draw it and what's appropriate and what isn't. And I think whatever happens, some people are going to be unhappy. So it's hard to know what exactly is right. Another kind of point to make is, again, what happens if these actors aren't out yet? What if you do have an actor who has been, for example, presenting as a cisgender man for however many years, most of his life, but he is actually transgender, but he's not out yet, and he sees this role and he's like, damn, this is the role of a transgender woman. This speaks to me, this feels right, I want to play it. And so he does, and he has an amazing time doing it, and he does a wonderful job. And then everyone gets mad at him for being a cis man in a transgender role, when really he is a transgender woman, he just hasn't come out yet. So again, you have to be very careful about these kind of judgments that you're making. And it's not just a matter of gender as well, but also sexualities. So again, it would be easy to say that only homosexual people can play homosexual characters, only heterosexual people can play heterosexual characters, only bisexual people play bisexual, and so on, It'd be very easy to say that, but again, it's kind of unrealistic. So if you look at kind of big mainstream films, there's a hell of a lot more lead roles, for example, that contain heterosexual romantic storylines. Why shouldn't a homosexual actor be able to play those big heterosexual roles if they want to? They should, right? They should have those big opportunities. And if that's the case, why shouldn't a heterosexual actor play a homosexual role? Because it is an act, it's a character that they're playing. It's part of their job to represent someone other than themselves. So I don't think it necessarily matters what the actor's sexuality is when presenting a character a certain way. That said, again, you don't want to stifle minority sexualities, do you? Again, there'll be some people who get mad at these ideas, but then you have to think about, like, what about, again, the actors who aren't out yet? What about actors who are, for example, bisexual? Can they only play bisexual characters, or are they allowed to play heterosexual or homosexual characters? Can they play both? Is that okay? Or should they play neither? Because it doesn't match up with their sexual identity. What about asexual actors or asexual characters? Like, there are lots of kind of different things here. What about characters in ongoing series who are, let's say for example, EastEnders, right? Big ongoing soap, you know it's like my guilty pleasure and I love it. Take Callum Highway's character in that. He was introduced as this shy, kind of nerdy kid. I think he was only supposed to have like a really short stint on the show, and then he had this little romance with Whitney, and fans loved him, so he got offered a full long-term contract. And he's engaged to Whitney, they have this whole relationship. I'm pretty sure, not 100%, I'm pretty sure the actor who plays Callum is straight. So he went into the show playing what he thought was a straight character in a straight romance, but as time went on and his character developed, they ended up having him question his sexuality and get into a relationship with Ben. And now I'm not sure if he's like necessarily put a label on it. I don't know if he's bi or gay. I think he's like more likely to be gay. But the point is, the actor is still a straight man. So when they developed Callum's character, should they have fired that actor and replaced him with an actor who was questioning their sexuality and eventually coming out as gay? No, of course not, because the actor was fantastic. His role was already established. He was very good in it, and he's done an excellent job portraying Callum's, I guess, questioning his sexuality, his identity, his relationship. He's done an excellent job. So that actor's sexuality doesn't matter. It's all about how he portrayed the character, and he's done a very good job in that, right? And then in another vein, let's talk about kind of abilities and differently abled people and neurotypical versus neurodivergent people. Let's take the example of autism on film and TV, right? There aren't all that many autistic characters out there, but it's great to see that slowly there's more and more representation. I think that's fantastic. I also think that in general, for example, with autism, maybe more neurotypical people go into acting than neurodivergent, and therefore there's more kind of options and opportunities for neurodivergent characters to be played by neurotypical people. So let's like take an example, right, and say we want to have a character in a show who they are in a wheelchair and they're disabled and they can't walk and blah blah blah. Great. It would make a lot of sense to hire an actor also in a wheelchair. That would be brilliant, right? But then again, what if we want to show scenes of that character before they're in the wheelchair? Then we can't use that disabled actor because they can't portray those before scenes. I know that sounds awful, but what do you do in that situation? Do you just have to scrap that huge part of your storyline because you're trying to be inclusive? Or should you be able to actually show the whole story with an actor who is able to play all the parts? And what about like the like let's say we're talking about like autism in film and stuff. Often autism isn't something that's visible and you're able to necessarily see. And so a lot of actors might not be open about the fact that they have autism or some other kind of neurodivergent I don't want to say issue, but like not condition either. State being I'm not sure what term I'm trying to use here. Again, if you have an autistic actor who isn't publicly saying, "Hey, I'm autistic," but they want to play an autistic role, people might get mad at them for that, and that's not really fair, is it? So I think a lot of the time we shouldn't necessarily be prying into actors' personal lives to see if it's appropriate for them to take on a certain role, because it might be they just might not want to be open and talk about it, you know? And I think actors still deserve a little bit of privacy when it comes to stuff like that. Another thing to consider that's a little more straightforward in some ways, but also because, you know, with things like sexuality and like being neurodivergent or having a disability or even in some cases like your gender identity, they're not always obvious and visible from the outside. But something that can be is race. And this is another issue where people have issues about who plays what roles. So they mentioned earlier the whole Scarlett Johansson thing, and I'm not going to comment on that because I don't know the original manga and I've not seen the film, so I don't know much about that. But let's talk, for example, about when people got mad about them casting a black actress to play Ariel in The Little Mermaid, and everyone was like, Ariel's not black, that's so bad. But I don't see any issue with that because Ariel's race has never been central to her storyline, so it doesn't really matter who plays her. Someone of any race could play that role, and they would still be a mermaid in the sea who wants to be a human. that's what the character's about, and it's not about the race. So in those cases, it doesn't really matter what race the actor is, as long as they do a good job portraying that character. However, I think if the race is important to the storyline, then obviously that should be considered when casting the role, right? So for example, sticking with the Disney theme, in Aladdin, you don't want to cast, for example, white actors as Jasmine and Aladdin because, being in Agrabah, having a sultan, Jasmine trying to stand up to like that kind of patriarchal society and wanting to break out of the rules that that society has set are all kind of central to the character, and their race is important in the main story. Therefore, if you did cast, for example, white actors in those roles, it wouldn't make sense and it would just be whitewashing for the sake of it and it would be awful. But on the other hand, traditionally, in the story of The Princess and the Frog, in all the storybooks I had growing up, the princess in that was a white girl. But people didn't get mad when they made her character black in the Princess and the Frog Disney film, did they? Because they wrote that story, so her race, again, was central to the story. She was a young black woman trying to start her own business in New Orleans in, what was it, the 20s, I think? And so her race became central to the story. And so that's why I think people didn't get mad about it. Other examples, Mulan, again, her race, the setting, it's all essential to the story and the plot. And therefore, for example, if you cast a black woman as Mulan, it wouldn't make sense either, because Mulan is Chinese and this is the whole point of the film. But on the other hand, if you took something like Rapunzel, where, yes, in the cartoon version, she's a blonde young girl, but that's not important to anything. The setting isn't that important, her look isn't that important, her race isn't that important, and therefore I think you could cast absolutely anyone in that role if you did a live action version, and it would be absolutely fine. But I think some people would still get mad at it because reasons and racism, but it wouldn't be an issue. On the other hand, Meridia from Brave, her being a white Scottish woman with this fiery, beautiful red hair and everything, that is central to the plot, that is central to her character, so you couldn't necessarily have someone of a minority playing her role as a white Scottish woman, because again, that wouldn't make sense. So I think we need to stop thinking about kind of like just, oh, what race is this character, and start thinking about what character traits does this what character traits does this character have, and does race actually have any impact on them or not, and so does it matter who we hire to play them. And in a similar vein, this is something that I've not really seen brought up in this discussion before, but I think it's interesting to mention age in this as well, because a lot of the time we see young teenage characters being played by people my age, and that's just a bit weird, isn't it? Or is it? It's so not uncommon to see actors in their mid and late 20s playing teenagers in high school and stuff like that. Is that okay? Is that acceptable? Why is it okay to have people of different ages playing characters of a certain age, especially when that's central to the plot, but it's not okay to have someone with a different race or sexuality or gender identity? Why is age different, but these other things aren't? And when I ask these questions, I'm not meaning it to imply that, like, when I say, why is this okay and this isn't, I'm not meaning that in a way to say, like, oh, therefore, none of them should be different, blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm genuinely asking, like, why do we put values on certain things and not others? What makes certain things okay and not others? Why do we value this and not this? Genuine questions here that I really, really want to hear your thoughts on. So I know this hasn't been like a comprehensive video. I know I haven't given you a lot of answers. I kind of more posed the questions, but I'd really, really love to hear your thoughts on things. Obviously, this is gonna sound crazy, but if I said to you, okay, I've got this character in my head that I'm writing a film for, and she is a 16-year-old cisgender bisexual Chinese girl, and you came to me and said, "Oh, I've got the perfect actor. He's a 40-year-old heterosexual cisgender man who is black. He's perfect for the role." You would look at that and think, "Well, that's ridiculous. How can this person portray this person when they're so different?" And so when you have these extremes, it's easy to see stuff like that, but it becomes a lot more difficult and complex when someone can essentially pass as a certain character or whatever. So, this 16-year-old bisexual Chinese girl? What if I had a young-looking 30-year-old homosexual Chinese woman to play that role? She could pass as that role. Would that be okay? Or would it not because she's a different age, she's a different sexuality? What if this was a transgender woman playing a cisgender role? Would that be okay because she can pass in that role? You know, all these different things that we kind of have to consider and think about. And it's very difficult and it's very complicated. And some things are going to upset some people and others are going to be more acceptable. And we kind of have to ask, why are some things acceptable and others aren't? Why do some things upset people and others don't? Who is getting upset and why? I think what's important though is that whatever kind of conclusions we come to, it's important that we keep asking these questions over and over and trying to be as inclusive as possible. We want to make sure that everyone is represented in the TV and films that we watch and consume, not only in the characters that they portray, but in the actual actors and people that we see on our screens and the role models we have and look up to. Diversity sounds like a buzzword, but it's actually really, really important. Everyone wants to see themselves represented somewhere in the best possible way, and everyone deserves to see that as well. That said, we have to remember that ultimately all of this is art, and art is incredibly subjective, and art doesn't have to be literal all the time, so maybe that's something to consider as well. I don't know, it's an interesting one, but I'm going to pass this over to you and ask you guys, what do you think of this whole thing? Please share your thoughts down in the comments below. I know I've kind of rambled a lot and kind of asked a lot of questions in this, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on the matter. But yeah, thanks for letting me ramble. Thanks for watching, and hopefully I will see you guys again very, very soon.